A flight attendant's day took a dramatic turn when she chose to mistreat a little black girl traveling alone in first class. Ignoring her needs, denying her food, and escalating to physical aggression, the attendant seemed to believe no one would hold her accountable. What she didn't know was who the girl's father was, a man determined to protect his daughter and challenge the injustice she faced. When the father, a powerful figure in the airline industry, discovered the treatment his daughter endured, he confronted the situation head-on. The fallout didn't just result in the immediate suspension of the flight attendant, it ignited a movement for justice that sent shockwaves through the airline industry, exposing systemic discrimination and demanding change. What happens when someone tries to dehumanize a child, only to be met with the unwavering resolve of a father and a nation ready to fight for equality? Stay with me, this is a story of love, resilience, and the fight for dignity you need to heed. The terminal at Newark Liberty International Airport buzzed with the familiar symphony of rushing footsteps, muted conversations, and rolling luggage. The morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting off the wings of waiting planes, each bound for a different corner of the world. Among the sea of travelers stood William Turner, a tall, composed black man in a sharp navy suit. His eyes flickered between his phone and his daughter, Maya, an 8-year-old bundle of energy bouncing at his side. Her bright yellow dress swayed as she skipped, clutching a worn teddy bear to her chest. "Daddy, is that our plane?" Maya pointed eagerly at a sleek white jet with blue accents. Her voice carried the unrestrained joy of youth, untainted by the worries that weighed on her father's shoulders. "Yes, sweetheart, that's our plane," William replied, forcing a smile as he pocketed his phone. His mind was elsewhere, on the crucial meeting awaiting him in Los Angeles, on the pile of work he had left behind, and, if he was honest with himself, on the subtle stares they had received since arriving at the terminal. Eyes that lingered just a moment too long, faces that turned away when caught. He was used to it, but he wished Maya never had to be. Priority boarding for Flight 672 to Los Angeles is now open. The announcement crackled overhead. "Come on, Princess," William said, taking Maya's hand. "Let's get you settled in first class." Her eyes widened. "First class? Really? Really?" He smiled, a rare indulgence for his little girl. This trip was meant to be special, a memory they could share amidst his grueling schedule. He didn't yet know how wrong he was. As they approached the boarding gate, the attendant scanned their tickets and offered a perfunctory smile. William noticed the slight falter in her expression when she looked at him, her gaze darting between him and Maya. It wasn't new, he had seen that hesitation before. That small flicker of surprise that spoke volumes. He held Maya's hand tighter and walked past without a word. The jet bridge smelled of stale air and disinfectant. Maya hummed a tune under her breath, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension her father felt. As they boarded, a blonde flight attendant with a polished smile greeted them. Her name tag read, Jessica. "Good morning, Mr. Turner. Welcome aboard," she said, her tone syrupy but hollow. Her smile faltered as her eyes shifted to Maya. "And who's this?" "This is Maya, my daughter," William said. "She'll be sitting in first class while I take care of some business in economy. Could you keep an eye on her for me?" Jessica's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, sir. She'll be in good hands." Maya beamed. "Thank you, ma'am," she said brightly. Jessica's eyes narrowed just slightly, a fleeting crack in her mask. "Isn't she polite?" she said, her tone shifting to one of faint condescension. William noticed it this time. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He crouched to Maya's level, pulling her close. "Remember, Princess, be on your best behavior. Okay? If you need anything, ask Jessica. I'll be back to check on you soon." Maya nodded solemnly, clutching her teddy bear tighter. "I'll be good, Daddy. Promise." He kissed her forehead, his heart heavy as he left her in the plush first-class seat. As he walked away, he cast one last glance over his shoulder. Maya was already peering out the window, her excitement undimmed. He didn't notice Jessica's smile vanish the moment his back was turned. Jessica's demeanor shifted as soon as William disappeared into the economy cabin. Her practiced smile hardened into a cold, distant expression as she turned to Maya. "Stay in your seat and don't touch anything," she said curtly, before striding away. Maya blinked, confused. She looked around the cabin. taking in the elegantly dressed passengers sipping their complimentary drinks. No one seemed to notice the change in Jessica's tone. Maya hugged her teddy bear, trying to ignore the uncomfortable knot forming in her stomach. The plane filled quickly, and Jessica began the safety demonstration. Maya tried to catch her eye, remembering her father's instructions to ask for water. But Jessica avoided her gaze entirely, her movements sharp and mechanical. When the plane took off and Maya's ears began to hurt, she pressed the call button timidly. Jessica appeared moments later, her face tight with irritation. "What do you need?" she snapped. "May I have some water, please?" Maya asked softly. "Service hasn't started yet. You'll have to wait," Jessica replied, switching off the call button without another word. She walked away, leaving Maya to fight back tears. As the flight progressed, Jessica's hostility became more apparent. She skipped Maya's row during drink service, ignored her polite requests for a blanket when the cabin grew cold, and even muttered under her breath when Maya accidentally dropped her teddy bear. "You people," Jessica sneered, her voice low enough that only Maya could hear. Always expecting special treatment. Maya didn't understand what she meant, but the venom in her tone stung. She pulled her knees up to her chest, wishing her father would come back. The excitement she had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a sinking dread. The climax came when Maya, growing hungry after hours without food, pressed the call button again. This time, Jessica stormed over, her patience clearly spent. "What now?" she hissed. "I'm hungry," Maya whispered. "Can I please have something to eat?" Jessica's eyes flashed with anger. "Your father didn't pre-order a meal for you. There's nothing left." "That's not true," a businessman across the aisle interjected. "I saw extra meals being handed out earlier." Jessica's smile reappeared, but it was sharp and dangerous. "I'll take care of it," she said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. She turned to Maya and leaned in close, her voice a venomous whisper. "One more word out of you, and you'll regret it." Maya shrank back, clutching her teddy bear as tears welled in her eyes. She didn't know what she had done wrong, but the pain of Jessica's words cut deep. She longed for her father, for the safety of his presence, but she was too afraid to call him. Unbeknownst to Maya, William was already on his way, and when he arrived, the injustice unfolding in first class would set off a chain of events that no one on that plane would ever forget. Maya Turner sat quietly in her plush first-class seat, her small fingers tracing the faded stitching on her teddy bear's ear. She had never flown alone, not without her father beside her, but she was determined to be brave. "Be on your best behavior," her father had said. "Ask politely if you need anything." She repeated his words in her head like a mantra. The cabin hummed with quiet conversation as passengers settled into their seats. Maya noticed the couple across the aisle sharing a glass of champagne, their laughter light and carefree. The man beside them scrolled through his tablet, engrossed in something she couldn't see. It was a world of calm sophistication, but Maya felt like an outsider looking in. Jessica, the blonde flight attendant, moved efficiently through the aisle, her smile fixed as she attended to the other passengers. But when her eyes landed on Maya, the smile faltered, replaced by a faint sneer. Maya shrank in her seat, clutching her teddy bear tighter. The plane took off, and the pressure in Maya's ears began to build. She remembered her father's advice: swallow or chew gum if your ears hurt. She didn't have gum, so she tried swallowing, but it wasn't enough. Tentatively, she pressed the call button, her small finger trembling as it hovered over the glowing light. Jessica arrived, her expression unreadable but her body language tense. "What do you need?" she asked. Her voice clipped. "My ears hurt," Maya said softly. "Could I have some water, please?" Jessica's lips pressed into a thin line. "We're not serving drinks yet," she replied, with a curt motion. She turned off the call button and walked away without another word. Maya blinked back tears. She didn't understand why Jessica seemed so angry with her. Had she done something wrong? She looked around at the other passengers, hoping someone might notice her distress, but they were all absorbed in their own worlds. Time crawled by, each minute feeling like an hour. The cabin grew colder, and Maya wrapped her arms around herself for warmth. She hesitated before pressing the call button again, afraid of Jessica's reaction, but the chill was too much. When Jessica appeared, her impatience was palpable. "What is it now?" "I'm cold," Maya whispered. "Could I please have a blanket?" Jessica sighed dramatically, her annoyance barely concealed. She returned moments later and tossed a blanket onto Maya's lap without a word. The blanket was still sealed in its plastic wrapper, and Maya struggled to open it with her small fingers. She glanced up, hoping Jessica might help, but the flight attendant was already walking away. "Thank you," Maya said quietly, though Jessica was too far to hear her. As the plane soared higher, so did the tension in Maya's chest. Her stomach growled loudly, a sharp reminder that she hadn't eaten since breakfast. The smells of warm meals wafted through the cabin as Jessica began serving lunch to the other first-class passengers. Maya watched longingly as plates of roasted chicken and fresh rolls passed by her seat. But Jessica skipped her row entirely. Maya waited until Jessica was nearby again and then spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Excuse me, ma'am, may I please have something to eat?" Jessica's eyes narrowed, her expression icy. "Your father didn't order a meal for you," she said flatly. Maya's cheeks burned with embarrassment. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught in her throat. Her father wouldn't forget something so important, would he? The businessman across the aisle cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said to Jessica, his tone polite but firm. "The young lady seems hungry. Surely there's an extra meal available?" Jessica's smile returned, but it was as sharp as broken glass. "We have procedures to follow." "Sir," she said smoothly, "I'll see what I can do." She walked away without looking back, and Maya sank deeper into her seat. Her stomach growled again, louder this time, and tears pricked her eyes. She blinked them away, determined not to cry. Crying would only make Jessica angrier. The tension reached its first breaking point when Maya accidentally knocked over her empty plastic cup. It rolled off the tray table and onto the floor with a soft thud. Jessica was there in an instant, her expression darkening. "Can't you even keep your seat tidy?" she hissed, bending down to pick up the cup. "This is why children shouldn't be in first class. You don't belong here." Maya's lip trembled, but she bit down hard, refusing to let the tears fall. She didn't know why Jessica hated her so much, but the weight of it pressed down on her like a heavy stone. As the hours dragged on, the hostility grew unbearable. When Maya finally gathered the courage to unbuckle her seatbelt and head to the restroom, Jessica appeared as if summoned by the sound of the buckle. "Where do you think you're going?" "To the bathroom," Maya said quietly. Jessica grabbed her arm, her grip firm enough to leave a mark. "You need to wait for me to escort you," she snapped. "We can't have you wandering around disturbing the other passengers." She marched Maya to the restroom, her fingers digging into the girl's arm. Inside the cramped space, Maya rubbed her arm where Jessica had grabbed her, staring at the faint red marks forming on her skin. For the first time in her young life, she understood what it felt like to be hated without cause. When Maya returned to her seat, her father's words echoed in her mind, "Be brave, princess. If you need help, ask for it." But how could she ask for help when the person she was supposed to trust was the one causing her pain? The storm was brewing, silent but unrelenting, and Maya sat at its center, clutching her teddy bear like a lifeline. Somewhere in the back of the plane, her father worked on his laptop, unaware of the battle his daughter was quietly fighting. But battles don't stay quiet forever. The minutes on the plane seemed to stretch endlessly for Maya. Every sound, every movement in the cabin felt magnified. The hum of the engines, the rustle of newspapers, the clink of glasses, all of it blurred together in a cacophony of discomfort and isolation. She sat perfectly still, afraid that the slightest movement might provoke Jessica again. Her teddy bear, once a source of comfort, now felt small and powerless in her grasp. The businessman across the aisle glanced over occasionally, concern flickering in his eyes. But he said nothing. It was the kind of silence Maya didn't fully understand but could feel, a silence she had seen in passing moments when her father encountered strangers who thought they knew who he was because of his skin. Jessica returned to the aisle, her smile now entirely gone when she glanced at Maya. Her footsteps were brisk, her movements sharp, as though the very sight of the little girl sitting in first class offended her. She leaned down, speaking softly but with unmistakable venom. "If you press that button one more time, I'll make sure your father hears about how disruptive you've been." Maya swallowed hard, her small hands clutching her bear tighter. She didn't dare look up. Her father had always taught her to be respectful. But respect felt like a one-sided effort on this plane. The turning point came with the turbulence. The plane shuddered slightly as it moved through rough air, and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a bit of turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Maya reached for her apple juice, trying to steady the glass with both hands. The plane jolted again, and the glass tipped, its contents spilling across her tray table and onto her yellow dress. She gasped, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. The sticky liquid seeped into the fabric, darkening it in uneven patches. She tried to clean it with the napkins she had, but her hands shook too much to be effective. Jessica was there in an instant, her shadow looming over the seat. "What did you do now?" she hissed, her voice low but cutting. "I'm sorry," Maya whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. "It was an accident." Jessica snatched the napkins from Maya's trembling hands. "Do you know how much work you're making for me?" she muttered, her voice just loud enough for Maya to hear. She leaned in closer, her tone laced with something cruel and familiar. "This is why you people don't belong here." The words hit like a slap. Maya didn't fully understand them, but she understood enough. The tone, the look, the way Jessica spat. "You people," like it was something dirty. Tears slipped down Maya's cheeks as she stared at her lap, her hands clenched into fists. The businessman across the aisle noticed this time. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. Jessica turned, her mask of professionalism snapping back into place. "Everything's fine, sir, just a little spill." She straightened, smoothing her uniform. "I'll take care of it." Maya didn't look up. She couldn't. The humiliation felt too heavy, the air too thick to breathe. Time passed slowly. The turbulence eased, but the tension in the cabin did not. Maya stayed silent, trying to disappear into her seat. She didn't notice the elderly woman sitting behind her until a hand gently touched her shoulder. "Sweetheart," the woman said, her voice warm and kind. "Are you all right?" Maya nodded quickly, her tears threatening to spill again. She didn't want to cause more trouble, but the woman wasn't convinced. She looked at Jessica, who hovered nearby, her arms crossed tightly. "I think this young lady could use some help," the woman said pointedly. Jessica's smile was back, cold and brittle. "I'm handling it, ma'am. Please enjoy your flight." The woman's eyes narrowed. "Handling it? You've done nothing but scold her since this flight began. Maybe you should consider who really doesn't belong here." Jessica's expression hardened, but she said nothing. She turned on her heel and disappeared into the galley. The elderly woman leaned closer to Maya, her voice soft. "If you need anything, don't be afraid to ask me. Okay?" Maya nodded again, her throat too tight to speak. Meanwhile, in economy class, William Turner couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest. He had tried to focus on the documents in front of him, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Maya. She had seemed so excited, but something in her eyes when he left her seat had tugged at him. He glanced at his watch. It had been over 2 hours. Too long. "I need a break," he told the colleague sitting beside him. Gathering his things, he made his way toward the first-class cabin. As he stepped through the curtain, his eyes scanned the rows, searching for his daughter. What he saw made his heart clench. Maya sat hunched in her seat, her dress stained and sticky, her face streaked with dried tears. Her teddy bear was pressed tightly to her chest, her shoulders trembling slightly. Jessica stood nearby, her posture rigid, her face a mask of practiced neutrality. William's voice was calm but firm. "What's going on here?" Jessica turned, startled by his presence. "Mr. Turner," she began, her tone saccharine, "your daughter has been difficult. She spilled her drink, made a mess, and has been disturbing other passengers." "That's not true," the businessman across the aisle interjected, standing up. "She's been quiet this whole time. If anything, your flight attendant has been treating her horribly." Jessica's eyes widened, her composure cracking for the first time. "Sir, I assure you." But William was already crouching beside Maya, his hands gently cupping her face. "Princess, are you okay?" he asked softly. Maya hesitated, her eyes darting to Jessica. The flight attendant's gaze was cold, her unspoken threat clear. "Daddy," Maya whispered, her voice shaking. "I'm sorry." William's jaw tightened. He noticed the red marks on her arm, the way she winced when she shifted in her seat. Fury burned low in his chest. Controlled but simmering, he stood, turning to Jessica. His voice was steady, but the power in it silenced the entire cabin. "You will explain to me." Right now. Why my daughter is sitting here covered in juice. Afraid to speak. And with marks on her arm. Jessica opened her mouth, but no words came out. The silence in the cabin was deafening. And then, the storm broke. For a moment, the cabin stood frozen, suspended in a brittle silence that threatened to shatter at the faintest tremor. William Turner's words had hung heavy in the air, cutting through the ambient hum of the plane like a blade. Jessica, the flight attendant, shifted uneasily on her feet, her polished exterior cracking under the weight of the scrutiny now directed at her. "Sir," she began, her tone an uneasy blend of condescension and defensiveness. "There's clearly been a misunderstanding. Your daughter—" "There is no misunderstanding," William interrupted, his voice low but firm, simmering with controlled anger. "Look at her. Look at my daughter. Does she look like she's been taken care of?" Maya shrank back into her seat, clutching her teddy bear as if it were a shield. The elderly woman seated behind her reached forward, placing a gentle hand on Maya's shoulder. A silent gesture of solidarity. Across the aisle, the businessman who had spoken up earlier now stood, his brows furrowed with concern. "This has gone too far," the man said, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "I've been watching the way you've treated this child since we boarded. It's unacceptable." Jessica's composure wavered, her mask slipping further. She glanced around the cabin, searching for an ally, but all she found were narrowed eyes and disapproving glares. "Mr. Turner," she said, a desperate edge creeping into her voice. "I was simply following protocol. Your daughter has been. Don't you dare blame her." William snapped, his voice rising just enough to draw the attention of passengers further back in the cabin. He crouched again, turning his attention to Maya. "Sweetheart, I need you to tell me the truth. What happened?" Maya hesitated, her small hands twisting the fabric of her stained dress. She glanced at Jessica, her fear evident, but when she met her father's steady gaze, something shifted. William had always been her safe place, her unshakable foundation. Maya's voice trembled, barely audible. She said, "I don't belong here." She grabbed my arm and she said I'd be sorry if I told you. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. William felt his chest tighten, a white-hot fury surging through him. He stood, towering over Jessica, his presence commanding. "Is that true?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "Did you threaten my daughter?" Jessica's mouth opened and closed, words failing her. The power dynamic she had relied on, the quiet complicity of bystanders. The unspoken permission to dismiss a little black girl in first class was crumbling before her eyes. The captain emerged from the cockpit, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but authoritative. William turned to face him, his anger tightly coiled. "Your flight attendant has been mistreating my daughter, ignoring her, insulting her, and physically grabbing her. I want an explanation." The captain's gaze flicked to Jessica, who looked pale and cornered. "Is this true?" he asked, his tone sharper now. "Captain Phillips, I was just—" Jessica began, but the businessman interrupted. "I can confirm it," he said, stepping forward. "I've seen how she's treated the girl. It's been appalling." The elderly woman added her voice. "She denied the child food and made her feel unwelcome. I tried to help, but she brushed me off." Passengers murmured in agreement, their voices a growing tide of support. Jessica's face turned an ashen gray as she realized the tide had turned against her. The captain's jaw tightened. "Jessica, step into the galley. Now." Jessica hesitated, looking as though she might protest. But the captain's stern glare left no room for argument. She stalked off, her footsteps heavy and unsteady. "Mr. Turner," the captain said, his tone conciliatory, "I deeply apologize for what's happened. Please, let me make this right. I'll ensure this is dealt with immediately." William crossed his arms, his fury still simmering beneath the surface. "What I want is accountability," he said, "and I want assurance that nothing like this will ever happen again to my daughter or anyone else." "You have my word," the captain replied. "Jessica will be relieved of her duties for the remainder of this flight. And I'll personally report this to the airline's management." As the captain returned to the galley to address Jessica, William knelt beside Maya again. "Are you okay, princess?" he asked softly, his anger giving way to concern. Maya nodded, though tears welled in her eyes. "I didn't want to make you mad, Daddy. She said it would be worse if I told." William's heart ached at her words. He pulled her into a gentle embrace, his hand cradling the back of her head. "You did nothing wrong," he said firmly. "You hear me? Nothing. This is not your fault." The tension in the cabin lingered even as Jessica was removed from the aisle, replaced by a different flight attendant who immediately brought Maya a fresh meal and a clean blanket. The passengers' murmurings grew quieter, their gazes a mix of sympathy and indignation. But William knew the damage had been done. He had fought countless battles like this one: quiet, insidious moments of prejudice and powerlessness disguised as protocol or professionalism. This one was different. This one had touched his daughter, left marks he couldn't immediately soothe or erase. He looked out the window at the endless expanse of sky, his resolve hardening. This wasn't just about Maya. It was about every child, every person, who had been made to feel small, out of place, or unworthy because of the color of their skin. This flight wasn't over, but neither was the fight. The cabin, once filled with the quiet hum of routine air travel, now simmered with a tension that could no longer be ignored. Passengers exchanged glances, their faces etched with varying degrees of discomfort, sympathy, and quiet outrage, but most remained silent, their complicity carved into the uneasy air. William Turner sat beside Maya now, his large frame a protective barrier between her and the world. She leaned against him, her small fingers clutching her teddy bear as though it might shield her from the lingering hostility. The stain on her yellow dress had dried, but the shame it represented hadn't. The new flight attendant, a younger woman with a kind face, moved quietly through the aisle, placing a fresh meal and drink on Maya's tray table. "Is there anything else I can get you, sweetheart?" she asked gently, her voice a balm to the wounds left by her predecessor. Maya shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "No, thank you." William watched the exchange, his jaw tight, his fury barely contained. The kindness of one person did little to erase the harm done by another. In the galley, Captain Phillips was speaking with Jessica in hushed but firm tones. The captain's face was taut with anger. His words clipped. "You've not only failed in your duty, you've jeopardized the trust this airline places in its employees. I've already notified the ground crew. When we land, you'll be escorted off the plane." Jessica's response was defiant. "This is being blown out of proportion," she snapped. "It's not like I hurt her. And honestly, maybe first class should be reserved for people who fit in." "Enough," Captain Phillips barked, his voice low but commanding. "Your behavior was unacceptable, and your prejudice has no place here or anywhere." Jessica fell silent, her defiance replaced by a growing sense of dread. She had pushed too far, underestimated the reach of her actions. But it was too late. The damage was done. Back in the cabin, William's thoughts churned. He couldn't shake the image of his daughter, her tears, her trembling hands, her whispered apologies for something that was never her fault. His anger wasn't just for Jessica, it was for the world that had allowed her behavior to fester unchecked. For so long, he had spent a lifetime navigating spaces where he wasn't wanted, where his presence was questioned, where he was forced to prove his worth. But Maya? She was just a child. The injustice of it burned in his chest. He had taught her to be polite, to be kind, to follow the rules. But what good were those lessons when the rules were bent against her? A voice broke his thoughts. "Excuse me," the businessman across the aisle said, leaning forward. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I should have spoken up sooner. What she did was wrong, and I didn't do enough to stop it." William nodded, his expression softening slightly. "Thank you," he said, "but this isn't just about us. It's about something much bigger." The man hesitated, then said, "If there's anything I can do to help, let me know." The plane hit another patch of turbulence, a brief jolt that made several passengers grip their armrests. Maya flinched, her small body curling closer to William. He wrapped an arm around her, murmuring reassurances, but his mind was elsewhere, turning over plans, strategies, ways to ensure this would never happen again. He glanced around the cabin, noting the faces of the passengers who had witnessed everything. Some looked away when he met their eyes. Others nodded in quiet solidarity. It was a microcosm of a larger world, a world where some fought for justice. Others turned away, and a few, like Jessica, perpetuated harm. As the plane began its descent, Captain Phillips returned to first class. He crouched beside William's seat, his face serious. "Mr. Turner, I want to personally apologize for what your daughter experienced. I've already taken steps to ensure Jessica is removed from her position. Effective immediately. William's gaze was steady. And what happens after that? Do you file this away as an isolated incident and move on? Because I can tell you, this wasn't isolated. Not for her. Not for me. Not for anyone who's had to deal with people like Jessica. The captain nodded, his expression thoughtful. You're right, he said. This isn't something we can sweep under the rug. I'll make sure this incident is reported to the airline's leadership. And if you're willing, I'd like to hear your suggestions on how we can do better. I appreciate that, William said, though his tone was guarded. Words were easy. Action was harder. As the plane touched down, the tension in the cabin reached its peak. Ground staff waited at the gate, their presence a stark reminder of the gravity of the situation. Jessica was led off the plane in silence, her head held high but her steps faltering. Maya watched her go, her expression unreadable. William turned to his daughter, his voice gentle. You okay, princess? She nodded, but her eyes were filled with questions she couldn't yet put into words. William squeezed her hand. We'll talk about it later, he said. Right now, let's get home. The passengers disembarked, some pausing to offer William quiet words of support. The elderly woman who had defended Maya stopped beside him, her hand resting briefly on his arm. Your daughter's a brave little girl, she said, and you're a good father. Thank you, William said, his voice thick with emotion. As they stepped into the terminal, the weight of the day settled over William like a heavy coat. But he straightened his shoulders, his resolve hardening. This wasn't over. It wouldn't be over until the system that allowed people like Jessica to thrive was dismantled. Piece by piece, holding Maya's hand tightly, he led her toward the exit. Outside, the world awaited imperfect, unjust, but still worth fighting for. And William was ready to fight. For Maya, for himself, for everyone. The sun was setting behind the Los Angeles skyline when William Turner stepped into the terminal with Maya's small hand tucked securely in his own. The golden light streaming through the expansive windows felt almost ironic, a bright, glowing contrast to the storm of emotions swirling in his chest. Maya walked silently beside him, her eyes downcast, her yellow dress still stained from the juice spill, a physical reminder of the humiliation she had endured. The airport was a cacophony of movement, families reuniting, business travelers rushing to make connections, announcements echoing overhead. But for William, it all faded into background noise. His focus was on Maya and the battle that lay ahead. As they moved toward baggage claim, a uniformed woman approached, her expression professional but kind. Mr. Turner, she said, I'm with airport security. I understand there was an incident on your flight. If you have a moment, we'd like to take your statement. William stopped, his grip on Maya's hand tightening slightly. Of course, he said, but first, I need to make sure my daughter is comfortable. The security officer nodded. We have a private lounge set aside. There are refreshments, and she can rest there while we speak. William crouched to Maya's level, his voice gentle. Princess, I need to talk to these people for a little while. Do you think you'll be okay sitting in the lounge? Maya hesitated, her eyes darting toward the security officer, then back to her father. Finally, she nodded. Okay, Daddy, I'll be okay. He kissed her forehead. That's my brave girl. The lounge was quiet, a stark contrast to the bustling terminal outside. Maya settled into a plush chair with her teddy bear, a juice box, and a snack, while William followed the security officer into an adjacent room. Inside, a table was set with notepads, a recording device, and a laptop. 2 additional officers were waiting, their expressions serious. Mr. Turner, thank you for taking the time. One of them said, we want to ensure that what happened to your daughter is thoroughly documented. William's voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of restrained fury. I want the same thing. Not just for my daughter, but for every family that trusts your airline to treat them with dignity. He recounted the events in painstaking detail: Jessica's initial coldness, her refusal to provide Maya with basic amenities, the veiled insults, and, finally, the physical aggression. His words were calm and measured, but each one carried the weight of a lifetime of similar experiences. The officers took notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When William finished, one of them spoke. Mr. Turner, based on what you've described and the witness statements we've gathered, it's clear that this goes beyond a breach of professionalism. It's a violation of both corporate policy and federal regulations regarding passenger treatment. We'll be pursuing an investigation." William leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "An investigation is a start," he said, "but I've seen investigations lead to nothing before. What I want is accountability, real accountability. Not just for her, but for the system that allowed her to feel emboldened enough to act this way." The officers exchanged glances. "Understood, sir," one of them said. "We'll be coordinating with the airline and local authorities to ensure this incident is addressed at every level." When William returned to the lounge, Maya was curled up in the chair, her teddy bear tucked under her chin. She looked up as he entered, her eyes tired but hopeful. "Are we going home now, Daddy?" she asked softly. "Soon, Princess," he said, sitting beside her and pulling her into his lap. "But first, I need to tell you something." She looked at him, her small face serious. "What is it? What happened today wasn't your fault," he said firmly. "Not even a little bit. That woman was wrong to treat you that way. Wrong to make you feel like you didn't belong. You belong anywhere you want to be. And no one has the right to tell you otherwise." Maya nodded slowly, her fingers playing with the edge of her teddy bear's ear. "But she was so mad at me, Daddy. I don't know why." William's chest tightened. "Sometimes people like her are angry because of things that have nothing to do with you. They see someone who's different, and instead of being kind, they choose to be cruel. But that says more about them than it ever will about you." As they left the lounge and headed toward the exit, William's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was an email from the airline's CEO, a brief but pointed message acknowledging the incident and promising a meeting to discuss systemic changes. William read it quickly, his expression unreadable. Outside, the cool evening air washed over them. A car was waiting to take them to their hotel. But before they climbed in, William crouched to Maya's level once more. "Listen to me, Princess," he said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "This isn't over. What happened to you today will not happen to someone else if I can help it. I'm going to fight for that, not just for you, but for every kid who deserves to feel safe and respected." Maya looked at him, her eyes wide and filled with trust. "I believe you, Daddy," she said. William smiled, though his heart was still heavy. "Good," he said, "because no matter how hard it gets, I'll always fight for you." As they drove away from the airport, the city lights flickering like distant stars, William's resolve hardened. The battle was just beginning, but he would meet it head on. For Maya, for himself, for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. The suite in downtown Los Angeles was spacious and quiet, but it offered little comfort to William Turner. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city lights, his reflection faintly visible in the glass. Behind him, Maya lay curled up in the large hotel bed, her breathing soft and steady. She was asleep, her yellow dress finally replaced with a warm set of pajamas. But William's mind churned restlessly. The email from the airline's CEO weighed heavily in his thoughts. It was a small crack in the wall, a gesture of accountability. But far from a promise of systemic change. He had seen gestures before. Symbolic acts meant to appease outrage without addressing the roots of injustice. This time, it had to be different. The following morning, William woke early, leaving Maya with a trusted babysitter from the hotel's staff. He arrived at the airline's corporate office downtown, his stride purposeful and his expression steely. He had been invited for a meeting, but he knew the game. They wanted to control the narrative, to minimize the damage. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The receptionist led him to a sleek conference room, where the CEO and several high-ranking executives were waiting. Their smiles were polite, their handshakes firm, but William could sense the tension beneath their professionalism. He didn't sit when offered a chair, instead, he stood, his presence commanding. "Before we begin," William said, his voice calm but unyielding, "I want to make one thing clear. This isn't just about my daughter. This is about a system that allowed someone like Jessica to feel emboldened enough to mistreat a child. If we're going to have this conversation, it has to go beyond apologies." The CEO nodded, his demeanor serious. "We understand, Mr. Turner. Please, tell us how you think we should proceed." For the next hour, William spoke with precision and passion. He outlined the failures he had witnessed, not just Jessica's behavior, but the bystander effect among her colleagues, the lack of accountability, and the broader cultural issues that plagued the airline industry. He shared his vision for change: comprehensive anti-bias training, a passenger bill of rights, stricter hiring practices, and a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. The executives listened, some nodding in agreement, others scribbling notes. But William could see the hesitation in their eyes, the resistance to change that came not from malice, but from complacency and fear of disruption. "This isn't just about avoiding lawsuits," William said, his voice rising slightly. "This is about trust. Passengers trust you to keep them safe, not just physically, but emotionally. That trust was broken for my daughter. And if you don't act, it will be broken for others." The meeting ended with promises to review his proposals, to convene a task force, to address the culture within the airline. William left the building knowing it was only the beginning. Change would not come easily. It never did. Meanwhile, back at the hotel, Maya was sitting in the lounge with the babysitter when a news segment caught her attention. The story about the flight incident had begun to spread. Reporters discussed the allegations, passenger statements, and Jessica's suspension. Maya's eyes widened as she recognized her father's name on the screen. "Daddy's on the news," she whispered to the babysitter, her voice a mixture of awe and apprehension. When William returned later that afternoon, Maya greeted him with the question that had been weighing on her mind. "Daddy, why is everyone talking about us?" William knelt beside her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. "Because what happened to you wasn't right," he said, "and when something isn't right, it's important to speak up. That's how we make things better." "But what if they don't listen?" Maya asked, her voice small. "Then we keep speaking up," William said firmly, "until they have no choice but to listen." Over the next few days, the story gained traction. Passengers who had witnessed the incident began sharing their accounts on social media, amplifying the call for accountability. Advocacy groups picked up the story, using it as a rallying cry for broader change within the airline industry. Not all the reactions were supportive. Online, William encountered the darker side of public discourse, the anonymous voices questioning his motives, accusing him of overreacting, dismissing his experiences as exaggeration. He shielded Maya from the worst of it, but the vitriol only strengthened his resolve. "This is the fight," he told a friend during a late-night call. "It's not just about convincing the people who agree with you. It's about challenging the ones who refuse to see the truth." One afternoon, as William was reviewing his next steps, he received a call from Captain Phillips. The captain's voice was steady but carried a note of urgency. "Mr. Turner, I wanted to let you know I've been asked to testify in the investigation. I want to make it clear that I'm on your side. Jessica's behavior was unacceptable, and I won't let the airline sweep this under the rug." William felt a flicker of hope. "Thank you, Captain. Your support means a lot. It's the least I can do." The captain replied, "What happened to your daughter? It shook me. It made me realize how much work we had to do." As the investigation continued, the airline faced mounting pressure from the public, the media, and its own employees. Protests erupted at major airports, organized by civil rights groups demanding systemic change. William found himself at the center of a movement he hadn't planned to lead but couldn't walk away from. At home, he made sure to carve out quiet moments with Maya, reading her favorite books, playing her favorite games, and reminding her of the love and safety she could always count on. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Maya looked up at him and asked, "Do you think it's working, Daddy?" William smiled, though his eyes were weary. "It's a start," he said, "but it's going to take time. And we're going to keep fighting together." Maya nodded, her small hand slipping into his. "I'll help," she said simply. William's heart swelled with pride. In that moment, he realized that the fight wasn't just for her, it was with her. Together, they would face whatever came next, determined to leave the world a little better than they had found it. The sun dipped low over the horizon, painting the Los Angeles skyline in hues of amber and crimson as William Turner sat at the edge of his hotel bed. Scrolling through his phone, the story had grown legs. Every major outlet had picked it up. Headlines that ranged from sympathetic to skeptical filled his screen. Airline faces backlash after incident with child passenger. Racial bias in the skies. A father demands accountability. Who belongs in first class? The Turner family's fight for justice. His heart was heavy with the weight of it all. The personal had become public, and there was no turning back now. Every interview, every social media post, Every call for reform was a reminder of the uphill battle ahead. But William was no stranger to steep climbs. He had been climbing his whole life. Downstairs, in the hotel's conference room, a coalition of activists, attorneys, and community leaders gathered to strategize. William had invited them, knowing that his voice alone wasn't enough. He needed allies, people who understood the stakes, who could amplify the message and push for systemic change. A prominent civil rights attorney, Vanessa Green, took the lead. "This isn't just about one incident on one flight," she said, her voice resonant and firm. "This is about the way certain people who look like Maya are made to feel unwelcome, unworthy, less than. It's about dismantling the structures that allow that behavior to go unchecked." William nodded, his jaw set. "I don't want this to end with a single apology or a headline that fades in a week. This has to be the beginning of something bigger." As the meeting wrapped up, Vanessa approached William. "I've seen cases like this before," she said. "They'll try to placate you with promises, maybe even a settlement, but they won't change unless you force them to. I don't want their money." William replied, "I want my daughter to grow up in a world where she doesn't have to explain why she belongs." Vanessa smiled, a glimmer of respect in her eyes. "Then we'll make sure they hear us." Meanwhile, the airline scrambled to contain the fallout. In a sterile boardroom miles away, executives debated their next move. Some argued for swift action, a public apology, the implementation of new training protocols, a high-profile donation to a civil rights organization. Others pushed back, worried about admitting too much too soon. "We don't want to look like we're caving," one executive said, his voice laced with frustration. "This could set a precedent." Another, the head of public relations, sighed. "The precedent has already been set. We need to act, or we're going to lose the public's trust." In the days that followed, the divide between action and inaction became clearer. On one side were those who demanded change, activists, passengers, employees of the airline who had faced similar experiences. On the other were those clinging to the status quo, unwilling to acknowledge the depth of the problem. The tension came to a head during a live television interview. William sat across from a seasoned journalist, his expression calm but resolute. The journalist's questions were pointed, designed to challenge him. "Mr. Turner," she began, "some critics have accused you of exaggerating the incident, of using your daughter's experience to push an agenda. How do you respond to that?" William didn't flinch. "I respond by asking why the burden always falls on people like me to prove our pain is real," he said, his voice steady. "Why do we have to explain ourselves? Justify our place in spaces we've earned, when the harm is plain to see? This isn't about exaggeration. It's about a culture that allows someone to look at a child and decide she doesn't belong." The journalist leaned forward. "And what do you hope to achieve with this fight?" "Change," William said simply. "Real, lasting change. For my daughter. For every passenger. For everyone who's ever been made to feel invisible." That night, the interview went viral. Clips of William's words flooded social media, sparking both outrage and inspiration. People shared their own stories of discrimination, their own moments of being made to feel small. The hashtag "We Belong Here" began trending, a rallying cry for those who saw themselves in Maya's story. But not everyone was moved. The backlash grew louder, more vicious. Anonymous comments flooded online forums, accusing William of playing the race card, of seeking attention. Hate mail arrived at his hotel, its words cruel and cutting. William read one particularly venomous letter late at night, the words blurring together in his exhaustion. He folded it neatly and placed it in his bag, a quiet reminder of what he was up against. The next morning, he showed it to Vanessa. "This is why we can't stop," he said. "This is what they want to scare us into silence." Vanessa's expression hardened. "Then we won't be silent." At home, Maya watched her father navigate the storm with a quiet admiration. She didn't fully understand the complexities of what was happening, but she understood the core of it. Her father was fighting for her, for others like her, for a better world. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, she looked up at him and asked, "Are you tired, Daddy?" William smiled, though his eyes were weary. "A little," he admitted, "but it's a good kind of tired. The kind that means you're doing something that matters." Maya leaned against him, her small hand slipping into his. "I think you're brave," she said softly. William's throat tightened. "And I think you're the bravest person I know," he replied. The pressure on the airline continued to mount. Employees began sharing their own stories of bias within the company, emboldened by the movement that had sprung up around Maya's experience. Advocacy groups called for boycotts, while lawmakers began drafting legislation aimed at addressing discrimination in the airline industry. It was no longer just a story about a little girl on a flight. It was a reckoning. As the days turned into weeks, William found himself at the center of something larger than he had ever imagined. The fire he had lit was spreading, illuminating truths that had long been ignored. And though the path ahead was uncertain, he knew one thing for sure: there was no turning back. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. William Turner sat in a stark conference room, the hum of fluorescent lights above blending with the quiet shuffling of papers. Across the table were representatives from the airline, a team of executives, legal advisors, and public relations specialists. Their faces were masks of polite professionalism, but their eyes betrayed a mix of anxiety and weariness. The pressure was mounting, and they were here to contain it. The meeting had been framed as an opportunity to discuss reforms. But William knew better. It was damage control, a bid to reclaim control of a narrative that had grown far beyond their grasp. Yet, William also understood the stakes. This wasn't just about his daughter anymore. It was about leveraging their moment of discomfort into lasting change. The airline's CEO began with a carefully rehearsed speech. "Mr. Turner, we want to begin by expressing our deepest apologies to you and your daughter for the distress you experienced. We take these matters seriously and are committed to learning from this incident." William listened, his expression unreadable. When the CEO finished, William leaned forward, his voice calm but cutting. "Apologies are easy," he said. "Change is harder. And what my daughter experienced isn't just an isolated incident. It's the result of a culture that allows bias to thrive, unchecked." The room fell silent. For a moment, the executives exchanged glances, as though silently debating how to respond. Finally, one of them, a senior vice president with a carefully neutral tone, spoke. "We agree that systemic change is necessary," she said. "That's why we're implementing mandatory sensitivity training for all employees and reviewing our hiring practices." William shook his head. "Training is a start, but it's not enough. What happens when someone like Jessica completes the training and still behaves the way she did? Where are the mechanisms to hold people accountable? Where's the transparency?" The tension in the room thickened. William could feel their discomfort. But he pressed on. "What I want," he continued, "is a passenger bill of rights. Clear policies that protect passengers from discrimination and ensure consequences for those who violate them. And I want it enforced not just at your airline, but across the industry." The executives shifted uneasily. One of the legal advisors spoke up, his tone cautious. "That's a significant undertaking, Mr. Turner. It would require coordination with regulators, unions, and other stakeholders. It's not something we can implement overnight." "I'm not asking for overnight," William replied sharply. "I'm asking for commitment, because if you don't act, this isn't going away. The public is watching, and they want to see more than promises. They want results." Outside the conference room, the movement continued to grow. Protests had erupted at airports across the country, with passengers and airline employees alike demanding accountability. The hashtag We Belong Here remained a rallying cry, sparking conversations about bias not just in air travel, but in workplaces, schools, and communities. Yet, with the momentum came opposition. A vocal minority pushed back against the movement, dismissing it as an overreaction or a distraction. William received threats, both anonymous and public, accusing him of being divisive, of playing the race card. Each message was a reminder of the deep roots of the problem he was fighting to address. That evening, back at the hotel, William found Maya sitting by the window, staring out at the city lights. She had been quiet since their flight, her usual exuberance muted by the weight of what had happened. He sat beside her, gently resting a hand on her shoulder. "Daddy," she said softly, "why do people hate us?" The question pierced him, sharp and unrelenting. He took a deep breath, searching for words that could offer her comfort without shying away from the truth. "Some people," he began slowly, "are afraid of what they don't understand. And instead of learning, they choose to hate. But that doesn't mean we let them decide who we are. We belong, Maya, just as much as anyone else. And no one can take that away from us." Maya looked up at him, her eyes filled with a quiet determination beyond her years. "Are you still going to fight them?" William smiled faintly. I am. And I'm fighting for you. Too. The next day, William received a call from Vanessa Green, the civil rights attorney who had become a key ally in his fight. I've got news, she said, her voice carrying a mix of excitement and urgency. A group of lawmakers wants to meet with us to discuss federal legislation addressing discrimination in air travel. William's heart quickened. That's a big step. It is. Vanessa agreed. But it's only a step. We'll need to push hard to make sure this gains traction. William nodded, though she couldn't see him. I'm ready. The meeting with lawmakers was held in Washington, D.C., in a stately room filled with polished wood and solemn faces. William spoke passionately, recounting not only Maya's story but the countless stories that had surfaced since. He emphasized the need for federal oversight, for clear standards that went beyond the goodwill of individual companies. One lawmaker, a woman with graying hair and a sharp gaze, leaned forward. Mr. Turner, your story is powerful, but change at this level takes time. What do you say to those who believe this isn't an urgent issue? William's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. I say ask my daughter if it's urgent. Ask the passengers who have been humiliated, ignored, or made to feel invisible if it's urgent. Justice delayed is justice denied. And we've delayed long enough. By the time William returned to Los Angeles, the movement had reached a fever pitch. Public pressure on the airline intensified, forcing them to announce the first steps of their reforms. Jessica, the flight attendant, was formally terminated, and the airline pledged to work with advocacy groups to implement the changes William had demanded. But William knew this wasn't the end. It was a victory, yes, but a fragile one. The real work ensuring those changes became permanent, systemic was just beginning. That night, as he tucked Maya into bed, she looked up at him with a small smile. Did we win, Daddy? William paused, brushing a stray curl from her forehead. We took a big step, he said, but the fight's not over. Maya nodded, her eyes heavy with sleep but bright with understanding. Then we'll keep going, she murmured. William watched as she drifted off, her words echoing in his mind. Yes, they would keep going. For Maya, for every child who deserved better. For a world where belonging wasn't a question, but a given. The day began with a heavy gray sky, the kind that seemed to press down on the city below, as though the world itself was holding its breath. William Turner stood in front of the mirror in his hotel room. Adjusting his tie, his reflection stared back at him calm, resolute, but with a fire simmering behind his eyes. This was the day he had been building toward. The day the airline would face him directly. Not in rehearsed apologies or quiet backroom meetings, but in a public forum. The press conference was being held in the airline's corporate auditorium, a cavernous space lined with rows of seats filled by reporters, activists, and employees. The stage was simple, a podium flanked by banners bearing the airline's logo. William sat in the front row, Maya beside him, her small hand clutching his. Her presence was both a reminder of what was at stake and a source of strength. The airline's CEO took the stage first, his expression somber. Today, we address a matter that has shaken our company to its core. He began. The incident involving Mr. Turner and his daughter, Maya, has exposed failures in our policies, our training, and, most importantly, our culture. For that, we deeply apologize. The audience was silent, their attention rapt. William listened intently, his face impassive. Apologies were a start, but they weren't enough. The CEO continued, outlining a series of reforms. Mandatory bias training, the establishment of an independent oversight committee, and a commitment to work with advocacy groups to create a passenger bill of rights. The promises were sweeping, but William knew they were also fragile words that could crumble without accountability. When it was William's turn to speak, the atmosphere shifted. The audience leaned forward, sensing that this was the moment they had come to witness. William rose, his tall frame commanding attention as he stepped onto the stage. He took a breath, letting the weight of the moment settle before he began. My daughter, Maya, is 8 years old, he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. She loves teddy bears and pancakes. And she lights up every room she enters. She is kind, polite, and, like any child, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. But on that flight, she wasn't. He paused, the silence in the room deep in charge. What happened to Maya wasn't just about one flight attendant or one bad day. It was about a system that allows people to look at a little black girl and decide she doesn't belong. It's about the silent complicity of those who see injustice and turn away. Maya looked up at her father. Her eyes wide, her trust in him unwavering. William continued, his voice rising slightly, the fire within him breaking through. Today, the airline has made promises. Promises to do better, to change, and while I am encouraged by those promises, I am not satisfied. Words are easy, action is hard, but action is what's required. The room erupted in applause as William stepped away from the podium. But he barely heard it. His focus was on Maya, on the work still ahead. He sat beside her, and she whispered, "You were amazing, Daddy." He smiled, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "Thank you, Princess. But this is just the beginning." In the weeks that followed, the promises began to take shape. The airline announced the creation of a diversity and inclusion task force. Chaired by Vanessa Green, the civil rights attorney who had become a key ally. The Passenger Bill of Rights, drafted with input from advocates and industry experts, was unveiled and adopted by several major airlines. It outlined clear protections against discrimination and established protocols for accountability. The movement sparked by Maya's story grew beyond the airline industry. Other sectors began examining their own biases, their own systems of exclusion. It was as if a floodgate had opened, and the tide could no longer be held back. But progress was not without resistance. Lawsuits were filed against the airline by other employees who claimed they had faced similar discrimination. And detractors continued to voice their opposition. William received more hate mail, some of it vile and threatening. He read each one, not out of masochism, but as a reminder of why the fight mattered. One evening, as he sifted through a stack of letters, he came across one that stood out. It was handwritten, the penmanship neat and deliberate. "Mr. Turner, I am a flight attendant who has worked in this industry for over 20 years. I've seen the kind of behavior your daughter endured, and I've stayed silent out of fear. But your courage has inspired me to speak out. Thank you for showing us what it means to fight for justice." William sat back, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. It was a small victory, but a profound one. Months later, on a bright spring morning, William and Maya boarded a flight together. This time, they were greeted warmly by the crew, their seats in first class prepared with care. Maya looked up at her father as they settled in, her eyes shining. "Do you think it's better now?" she asked. William considered her question carefully. "It's better," he said, "but there's still work to do." Maya nodded, her small hand slipping into his. "Then we'll keep going." William smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Yes, Princess, we'll keep going." As the plane took off, carrying them toward a new destination, William gazed out the window at the endless expanse of sky. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time, he felt a sense of hope that the world could be a little brighter, a little fairer, for the generations yet to come. The soft hum of the city outside served as a backdrop to the quiet intensity in William Turner's home office. It had been 6 months since Maya's story broke, and the world around him had shifted in ways both subtle and seismic. The movement sparked by his daughter's ordeal had grown beyond anything he could have imagined, touching corners of society where the shadows of prejudice had lingered unnoticed for too long. The first major test of the reforms came unexpectedly. An incident involving a passenger from another airline had gone viral. A man of color denied boarding because of security concerns that were later proven baseless. The public outrage was immediate, but this time, the response felt different. It wasn't just anger, it was action. Advocacy groups mobilized quickly, demanding accountability and citing the changes William had fought for as a benchmark. The Passenger Bill of Rights, once seen as aspirational, was now a rallying point. William's phone rang incessantly that week. Reporters, lawyers, activists all seeking his voice. He gave interviews, but he also understood that the moment required more than words. He reached out to Vanessa Green. "This is it," he said, pacing his office. "This is our chance to make the Bill of Rights a federal standard." Vanessa didn't hesitate. "Let's draft the legislation." The fight for a federal standard was relentless. William found himself in Washington, D.C., more often than he was home. He testified before congressional committees, his words a mix of data and deeply personal conviction. He spoke not just of Maya, but of the thousands of passengers who had shared their stories since. Each one was a thread in a tapestry of injustice, woven tightly but unraveling under the weight of collective courage. The opposition was fierce. Lobbyists for major airlines pushed back, citing costs and logistical challenges. Some lawmakers dismissed the effort as overreach, questioning whether legislation was truly necessary. During one particularly grueling hearing, a senator leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "Mr. Turner, you've made a compelling case. But are you suggesting that bias can be legislated out of existence?" William met his gaze evenly. "I'm suggesting," he said, his voice steady, "that while we can't change hearts overnight, we can set standards. We can create systems that hold people accountable and protect those who are vulnerable. And maybe, just maybe, those standards can help change hearts in the long run." Outside the halls of power, the world was changing in its own way. Airlines that had initially resisted the movement began adopting elements of the Passenger Bill of Rights voluntarily. Fearing the loss of public trust, employees underwent training not just on bias, but on empathy and accountability. Complaints of discrimination began to decline, though William knew there was still much work to be done. Maya watched it all with a mixture of curiosity and pride. At 8 years old, she didn't fully grasp the scope of her father's work, but she understood its heart. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, she turned to him. "Daddy," she said, "does this mean no other little girl will have to feel like I did?" William paused, his throat tightening. "That's what I'm fighting for, Princess," he said. "That's what we're all fighting for." But the fight wasn't without its toll. The hate mail persisted, some of it more vicious than ever. There were moments of doubt, moments when the weight of it all felt crushing. William leaned on Vanessa, on the coalition of allies he had built, and on his own unshakable belief that the fight was worth it. One particularly dark night, as he sat alone in his office, he found himself staring at a photo of Maya from before the incident, a candid shot of her laughing, her face lit with unbridled joy. He realized then that his work wasn't just about protecting that joy for her. It was about reclaiming it for every child who had ever been made to feel less than. The turning point came when the federal bill was brought to a vote. The days leading up to it were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and rallies. On the morning of the vote, William stood on the steps of the Capitol, addressing a crowd that stretched as far as he could see. "We are here because we believe in a better world," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "A world where dignity isn't a privilege, but a right. A world where no one has to question whether they belong. And today, we take one step closer to that world." The bill passed narrowly, its victory hard-fought but deeply significant. For William, the moment was bittersweet. He knew the passage of legislation wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a new chapter in the fight for justice. But it was a victory nonetheless, a testament to the power of persistence, of collective action, of refusing to accept the status quo. That evening, back home in Los Angeles, William sat with Maya in the backyard, the stars twinkling overhead. She leaned against him, her small hand resting on his. "Did we win, Daddy?" she asked, her voice soft. William smiled, his heart full. "We won a battle," he said, "but the war isn't over. There's still so much to do." Maya nodded thoughtfully. "Can I help?" "You already have," William said, kissing the top of her head. "More than you'll ever know." As the night deepened, William gazed at the stars, feeling a quiet sense of hope. The world was far from perfect, but it was changing, slowly, painfully, but undeniably, and he would keep fighting always for Maya, for himself, for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. The day began with a quiet stillness. William Turner sat at the kitchen table, the morning light filtering through the windows and spilling across the wooden surface. A newspaper lay in front of him, its headline bearing the words he had fought so hard to see, "Passenger Bill of Rights signed into law." He ran his fingers over the print, as though touching it might make it feel more real. The photograph beneath the headline showed him standing with lawmakers and advocates, Maya at his side, her small hand clutching his. It was a moment of triumph. But William knew it was also a moment of reckoning. Maya entered the kitchen, her bright eyes still heavy with sleep. She climbed onto the chair beside him and glanced at the newspaper. "Is this about us, Daddy?" she asked. "It's about everyone, Princess," William replied, pulling her close. "But yes, it started with us." She studied the photograph, her small face thoughtful. Does this mean it's over? William hesitated. Not over, he said carefully. But it's a big step. And it means the world is paying attention. The weeks following the bill's passage were a whirlwind. Advocacy groups celebrated the victory, while detractors doubled down on their criticism. The implementation of the law faced logistical challenges, and William found himself in meetings and interviews, ensuring that the promises made would not be left to gather dust. Despite the noise, there were moments of profound clarity. At a community forum, a young woman stood up to speak. Her voice trembled as she recounted her own experiences with discrimination, but her words were steady. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her gaze meeting William's. "Because of you, I feel like someone finally sees me." The room erupted into applause, but William's eyes stayed on hers, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Moments like these reminded him why he had begun the fight in the first place. Not everyone embraced the change. A viral video surfaced of a passenger berating a flight attendant, accusing them of enforcing unnecessary rules outlined in the new legislation. It was a stark reminder of how deeply some resisted progress, clinging to a world where their comfort depended on the discomfort of others. William watched the video late one night, the glow of his laptop casting long shadows in the room. He felt the familiar weight of exhaustion, the sense that every step forward was met with resistance. But then he remembered Maya's question, "Does this mean it's over?" And his answer, "No, it wasn't over. It never would be." One morning, months later, William was invited to speak at a university. The lecture hall was packed, filled with students, faculty, and members of the community. Maya sat in the front row, her presence a grounding force. William began quietly, his words deliberate. "Racism is not always loud. Sometimes, it whispers. Sometimes, it hides behind polite smiles and well-meaning intentions. But its impact is no less devastating." He paused, scanning the room. "What happened to my daughter on that flight wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of something larger, something woven into the fabric of our society. And while we've taken steps to unravel it, the work is far from done." The room was silent, the weight of his words settling over the audience. Then, he smiled, a flicker of hope breaking through. "But here's the thing about fabric. It can be rewoven. It takes time, effort, and the willingness to see the threads for what they are. But it can be done." After the lecture, a student approached him, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. "Mr. Turner," she said, her voice hesitant, "how do you stay hopeful? Doesn't it feel like there's always another fight? Another battle?" William considered her question. "It does," he admitted, "but hope isn't about ignoring the struggle. It's about finding meaning in it. It's about knowing that every fight, every small victory, makes the world a little better for someone else." The student nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." That night, back home, William tucked Maya into bed. She looked up at him, her face illuminated by the soft glow of her nightlight. "Daddy, do you think people will always be mean to us?" William's heart ached at her question, but he met her gaze steadily. "Not always," he said, "because there are people like you in the world. Maya, brave people who stand up and say, 'This isn't right.' You have the power to change things." Maya nodded, her eyes heavy with sleep but bright with determination. "Then I'll help," she murmured, echoing words she had said before. William leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You already are, princess." As he stepped out onto the porch, the night air was cool and still. He gazed at the stars, their light a reminder of the vastness of the world and the small but significant place he and Maya held within it. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt the faint stirrings of a new kind of hope, one that wasn't just his, but shared by so many others. In the quiet of the night, William whispered a promise to himself, to Maya, to the world. "We'll keep going.